Welcome everyone. This is Venkat for eedina. Eedina, as you know, is a community media house and we are located in Bangalore. This election results are out and pretty much everybody agrees that this election was between BJP and the People's Movement. And when we talk about People's Movement, it is civil society, it is public intellectuals, it is activists, and it's also common people who have been working towards making sure that the state remains democratic. And in this regard, I'm very, very excited to have Venkatesh Nayak with us. I will ask him to introduce himself, but I'll also want to say whether it was the policy of BJP government, whether it's demonetization, which played havoc with the economy. A little later, we discovered that the electoral bond has lots of loopholes and perhaps was one of the biggest corruption scams. And even further, we realized that the referee of elections, this EVMs or whether it's the election commission itself, was not playing a fair game. In all this regard, our guest has played an important role, asking questions of accountability, which is so critical for democracy. So first I would like him to tell us a little bit about himself, and then we'll jump directly into the questions of elections and accountability and transparency. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me over. So I am primarily an advocate for transparency. I've been working in this field for 2.5 decades now. This is my 25th year. And the primary purpose of joining this segment of society, I should have been an academic, but I wanted a life of an activist, to be able to reach out to a group that's larger than students sitting in a classroom. So therefore, this is the area of work that I chose. I was quite fortunate to be part of the entire exercise, which was supported by People's Movements for Transparency, which was the drafting of the Right to Information law in the year 2004 and 2005. And ever since, I've been focused entirely on either training the supply side of information or the demand side of information for using this law, and training civil society groups, media persons, academics, researchers, and also government officers to implement the law in the right spirit and according to the procedures laid down. In that context, as you have explained in the very generous introduction that you've given me, there have been several areas where I've tried to make interventions through the Right to Information Act with the primary purpose of getting more information out there for the people to understand about these issues than what government or other public authorities were willing to disclose, because that was not adequate. And that's the reason why the right to information becomes a very important constructive tool to get more information out there in the public domain, so that people are able to understand several issues that are dominant at any point of time in current affairs and political affairs, or even economic affairs for that matter. So that's where I've been engaged in building capacity for people to make use of the Right to Information law, and making strategic RTI interventions to bring in greater transparency as the first step towards making government and public authorities accountable to the people and to the law.
Thank you so much. The first thing I'll do is ask you, what is your reaction of the election result?
Well, I'm so glad that the election results have completely belied the exit poll results. I don't know why that kind of a canard was floated less than 24 hours before, after I think barely a few hours after polling came to an end in the 7th phase. I'm quite happy that the mandate of the people is making itself quite evident in many places, although there are people who are doubting clean sweeps in many other parts, for example, Madhya Pradesh or Chhattisgarh, or even Gujarat for that matter. There are doubts being raised about certain kinds of seats in different parts of the states. Those of course will always be subject to inquiry and investigation eventually. But I think overall what has happened is the people's voice has been reflected in this mandate to a large extent. And if, as many people are saying, that this is a fractured mandate, well, what else do you expect when every individual is supposed to vote according to his or her conscience? That I completely do not understand that how is it that the income tax department can withdraw money from a political party's bank account by saying that this is part of the dues that you are owing us. Where in post-independent Indian history has this happened? And which law permitted it? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but that's for experts to explain. So I would say that then the control of the mass media, which actually is a major influencer, as we have seen over the years, which was in the control of the ruling establishment. And the opposition parties simply didn't have the kind of resources that were adequate to counter them. Nevertheless, they've come to this stage where the India Alliance has its 3-digit figures. There are more than 232 or so. And I think in the face of the onslaught that the ruling establishment had let loose, this performance is amazing. And there I would say that a phenomenal amount of participation of people who are otherwise or groups that are otherwise not recognized to be politically partisan. For example, those who are social media influencers, or let us say researchers, or I remember when I was outside the counting hall 3 days ago, there were a couple of people who were distributing copies of the preamble of the Constitution, and they were paying out of their pockets for doing it. Why is it? That's because they believe in the Constitution's values, and they believe and they expect officials who have the authority to implement the Constitution to implement it in letter and spirit. So it is that kind of support which the segment that was outside of the ruling establishment had, which I think has led to these kinds of results. And apart from that, of course, Lagan was hugely entertaining, but I'm afraid I don't think anything about the recently concluded electoral process was entertaining at all, except for the satirical responses and comments that came through the social media influencers. That was amazing. But for that, everything else was gut-wrenching, was quite unbelievable, especially certain kinds of fantastic and I would say phantasmagorial claims that were made about one's dissent. No, that's not the kind of debate, discussion or discourse that one would expect in a democratic polity. Perhaps in a dictatorial one, yes, but we had to see it in these elections, and I think that's quite unprecedented. There was a time when the entire country was equated with a certain personage, but now this transcended even all of that and went to the sublime. And that, I think, is something which is completely anathema to democracy, because democracy, for the simple reason that it is founded on the philosophical basis of equality of all, cannot and should not and must not tolerate the iconization of any personality, because that is anathema to democracy.
Thank you so much. We'll stop the analogy of the Lagan, but I would go back and say Bhuvan did win and the team of Lagan did win, and that's the mandate of people. I'll go into slightly two technical areas where you have been working. One is the political funding is very, very important. There is a common joke which is used, saying that to lose an assembly election you need 10 crores, but to win 20 crores. So if that's the scale of money that is required, not having funding is nearly means you cannot win certain elections. And electoral bonds played a very important role. Can you help us and the audience understand what did it mean for having control over electoral bonds, and how, even though it got revealed the money were already with BJP, what does it mean to have all that money with BJP and how they already had an upper hand? After this, we'll come to the Election Commission, but if you could explain.
Yes. Before I specifically talk about electoral bonds, which was an area that I have worked on, let me also put a word of caution here. Electoral bonds, and I have written about this elsewhere, electoral bonds are actually the proverbial flies that sit on the tip of the ice shelf, not even iceberg. Ice shelves are much bigger. They run into several thousands of miles. The electoral bonds are the proverbial flies that sit on the ice shelf of what is called political party financing. The estimate that Center for Media Studies based in Delhi made is that anywhere between 50 to 60,000 crore rupees are spent on elections, which is not actually the official total of the expenditure of partisan candidates. It's much less, it's just a fraction. So if you look at the quantum of electoral bonds that were sold and redeemed, it comes to, I think, just about 10 or 15% of that figure. So we really need to be worried, and we need to think about ways and means of exposing this other hidden segment of political party financing that is simply never brought into account. And what do I hint by that? It's the gunny sacks of cash which were not seized by the Election Commission during campaigning, but still we know got distributed. Rates were very well known, how much was distributed in which community, the expectation of how much the recipient would keep as a cut for himself or herself and distribute the rest of it. None of that is actually amenable to inquiry or investigation in this country. But now let's come to electoral bonds. Electoral bonds, of course, as you know, I think about they were sold in about 20 odd phases, and I think in the range of about 17,000 or so, 70,000 crores, and the lion's share of that went to the BJP. What was usually problematic with the electoral bond system of financing was that you simply didn't get to know who was paying how much money to which political party. And that I'm glad the Supreme Court in its landmark judgment has clarified earlier this year that there is a right to know the political campaign contribution that individuals make, high net worth individuals, or which corporates make, or electoral trusts make to political parties. Citizens have a right to know, and those should not be hidden. And when the data became public thanks to this enforcement of the right to know by the Supreme Court of India, it was so clear that the field, in terms of, again, we can use the analogy of Lagan, the field as far as political party financing was concerned was rigged. It was skewed in favor of the ruling party, and that is what was hugely problematic. They got the lion's share somewhere in the range of about 6,000 plus crores. And of course, later on they put a spin on it, saying the rest of it went to so many other parties, and they tried to do a per head, per capita, which was a very silly way of looking at financing. But the fact that so much more went into the financing of this election process by the parties, that is something that really needs to be inquired into. It's one thing to employ the Enforcement Directorate or the Central Bureau of Investigation or any other law enforcement agency to go after individual politicians or political parties, but this phenomenon of money, which people, experts like Professor Arun Kumar, who's written about the black economy, this is literally black money unaccounted for prior to elections, which actually comes into play during elections to influence the outcome, and we have no way of investigating that. Now that is what is hugely problematic, and I'm hopeful that the next government, I know it is still going to be led by the NDA, but at least their allies who have talked about these issues earlier will put their foot down, bring their influence to bear to set up at least a judicial commission of inquiry that will look at this process. There was an opportunity that was available in 2016. You mentioned demonetization, and that was the time when all money, including black money, went back into the banking system. So it was at that point of time that if there was the willingness and the commitment to do it, as was expressed by the Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, that he would remove the influence of black money from politics and anything that would influence political decision making, that was the time to actually monitor large scale withdrawals after the introduction of the new currency notes. How else would you get 60 to 70,000 crores, 50 to 60,000 crores to be spent on the current elections unless those large withdrawals were not available? But nobody has monitored them, nobody has questioned them. Where was that money drawn from? Which banks? Where was that money parked? Which sectors of the economy? And then how was it withdrawn? None of this has been inquired into, and this is the right moment for the allies of the BJP to insist that if you really want to deliver on your promise of reducing corruption, curbing corruption entirely, and eradicating the influence of black money on Indian politics, this is the moment to do that. Set up a judicial commission of inquiry, give them a broad terms of reference, and make all the law enforcement agencies at the central level and state level to assist them and support them in unearthing this huge mountain of black money that has been deployed during these elections.
Yeah, wonderful. Small digression on the electoral bonds itself. You spoke about how within the political funding, this might just be a very small bit. Yes. There is also belief that the things which were done in favor of this, not just the political one, many economic assets being sold, it may also be another scam of scams. Both sides, whether it's only a small tip, but it could also have led to many quid pro quo, lowering of prices, selling licenses much more easily. Is that also something we should be looking to go after to understand this web of corruption which is there?
Absolutely, because policies have been influenced since the time of independence by the corporates, and they have been, in fact, this is one of the running jokes in civil society, that if the organization which I head up right now, my initial training in the organization was to learn the strategies for advocacy. And one of the running jokes was that if you want to learn how to be a successful advocate, you should learn it from corporates, because they are the ones who've had the most amount of influence on policy making in this country, whereas civil society, despite all the noises that it makes and despite all the efforts that it puts in, has not always been as successful, with the exception of that period between 2004 and 2014 when we got very, very progressive, welfare-oriented, rights-based laws in this country, and thanks to civil society intervention, and no thanks to corporate sector, because they were opposed to many of these laws, like the National Food Security Act. They were opposed to it. Why give free food to people? The Rural Employment Guarantee Law, this will make people lazy. So those kinds of opposition was definitely there, and they thought the money that they were paying in the form of corporate tax was all going to be misused. But COVID showed how that set of laws actually provided, to some extent, the cushion which was required for people who were completely out of work, who didn't have, and the lockdown imposed by the pandemic was another major put another major dent in their ability to fend for themselves and for their livelihoods. But anyway, coming back to your question, the influence of corporate sector on policy making, be it disinvestment or a change in policy, let us say with regard to exports or imports, etc., the influence, the imposition of anti-dumping duties or reduction in the rates of import duties, etc., all of these are reported as news. Under the Right to Information Act, we have the right to know the details of the decision making process, not simply by asking. Government has a duty to proactively disclose all that information. That never happens. So I think with this kind of electoral outcome, civil society and the mass media, particularly those who are not part of the metro media, as some people call it. I don't want to use the other fanciful term as to what kind of a lapdog media it is, but those media persons, along with civil society and most importantly academics who have the expertise to analyze these matters, should actually start probing over the last 15 to 20 years what kind of influence the corporates have had, particularly in the last 10 years, let us say. The decisions to privatize, the decisions to give away our airports, our ports, which were all part of the public sector earlier, but now they have all been privatized. What has been the step-by-step process of the decision making with regard to all of this? Who had what kind of influence? Now, I can give you an example. Some years ago, this is an RTI intervention that I did, where I was not successful, but another gentleman who was, I think, based in Hyderabad, he was successful. He asked the same questions. There is a certain requirement in the law relating to export and the various laws relating to the export and import of commodities in India. Certain kinds of data have to be made public in terms of where it is sourced from, what kind of quantities come in, what kind of duties are paid, and all of that. Now, that was part of a rule that was already put in place by the UPA2 regime. Under the NDA2 regime, that rule was removed. And the documents that this RTI activist managed to get actually showed that the ones who wrote to the government saying that this transparency requirement should be removed because it is hurting their business, and their reasons were certainly not convincing. There were some odd bicycle manufacturer somewhere in Gujarat, some fellow who was manufacturing nuts and bolts and some such commodities which were not really top of the sector kind of companies, they were getting the policy influenced. We had never heard of those companies. So were they proxies for the corporate houses?
Wow.
We don't know. But the data showed that, the information released through the RTI showed that. So I think there is a major and urgent requirement. I always say that while you can hold accountable people in government accountable at the time of elections, you also hold people accountable, whoever forms the government between elections, using the right to information law. Sure. Accountability is not simply at the time of voting, but how do they govern during the 5 years that are in between two election phases. How is that governing happening? People have to examine, people have to explore, people have to probe, and that is, I think, a sacred duty. The right, of course, is there to seek information, but it's also a duty to use it if we want our polity, our decision making processes to become transparent and accountable, and a lot of muck that underlies these changes, if that needs to be exposed.
ಮತ್ತಷ್ಟು ವಿಶೇಷ ವಿಡಿಯೋಗಳನ್ನು ನೋಡಲು ಮತ್ತು ಹೊಸ ವಿಡಿಯೋಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ತಿಳಿಯಲು
eedina.com ಯೂಟ್ಯೂಬ್ ಚಾನೆಲ್ ಸಬ್ಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಮಾಡಿ
ಮತ್ತು ಬೆಲ್ ಐಕಾನ್ ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ.